Well, good evening, everybody. The time is upon us. My name is Belinda DeKay, and I'm Director Emeritus of the Stonington Free Library. And on behalf of the board and the program committee, I welcome you all to another of our Sunday evening lecture series. I have two requests. Please make sure your cell phones are silenced, and please wave your hand if you can't hear me. This evening we are celebrating the centennial of the birth of a great American poet of the 20th century, Anthony Hecht. And there is no one who can speak with greater authority on his life and work than our distinguished guest, our neighbor and friend, Professor Jonathan Post, who, as Anthony Hecht's student, colleague, and lifelong friend, edited the selected letters of Anthony Hecht and wrote the study of Hecht's poetry, A Thickness of Particulars. One reviewer wrote of this book that it is a study by a critic who feels profound sympathy with his subject and who often seems endowed with Hecht's own power to illuminate even when exploring the darkest events of human history. It is easy to see why these two human beings of such intellectual, spiritual, and scholarly stature would be drawn to each other, and how Jonathan Post would come to write of Anthony Hecht's work with such empathy and understanding, and to edit his letters in such an illuminating and engaging way. Professor Post is a noted Shakespearean scholar. You will be familiar with his study of Shakespeare's sonnets in the Oxford University Press's very short introduction series. And he has authored many books and studies, including ones on Milton, Sir Thomas Browne, and the 17th century metaphysical poets such as Andrew Marvell, George Herbert, and Henry Vaughan. He is also a scholar of 20th century poetry, and in addition to papers on Seamus Heaney and T.S. Eliot and his works on Anthony Hecht, he has written a seminal study of the poetry of Elizabeth Bishop, again in the Oxford University Press very short introduction series, which you will remember he discussed here in the library just 1 year ago. So it is a great delight to welcome him back once again to share his insights and knowledge with us. Jonathan Post is Distinguished Research Professor of English at UCLA, where he was formerly chair of the English department and founding director of the UCLA Summer Shakespeare program in Stratford and London. He has been recipient of many fellowships, among them the Folger Shakespeare Library, the National Endowment of the Humanities, you have to forgive my pronunciation, the Burlesco Foundation, and the Guggenheim Foundation. We are honored and very grateful to him to have him read Anthony Hecht's poetry and to speak to us this afternoon. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to our guest, Professor Jonathan Post.
Okay, Jonathan. Yep, this is for the live stream. Okay, and then adjust this.
Okay, all right, great.
Get in the microphone adjusted. Sorry, everyone. Is that a good level for you,
Yeah,
Jonathan?
then just to bring it over here.
Okay.
Okay.
You're good.
Can you hear me back there?
Just turned it on. You should be good.
Can you hear me okay back there? And be sure to raise your hand back there if you can't hear me. My wife tells me she never can hear me. So I want to thank Belinda for the introduction. I never recognized myself. And she exaggerates everything but it's nice to be exaggerated about. I also want to thank Millie Donovan right here. She really helped with this whole operation. Carla also. Alyssa Downey, who I have not met, but she helped quite a bit too. And where is she? Michaela Hall, who makes the whole thing buzz and run. I'm going to just talk a little bit about Hecht, and then I'm going to read some of his poems. I'm really not going to do much explication, just kind of lay the poems out there for you. I should say a couple of things, just in terms of his life. He really published in the second half of the century, almost exactly from like 1950 to the year 2000. I mean, give or take a few years there. So he's really a poet of the second half of the 20th century. And he was born in 1920, and his great compatriots really in that terrific decade of poets were James Merrill, Richard Wilbur, and John Hollander. And I'd like to claim, because Willard's here, Amy Clampett, but they hardly knew each other, though they did exchange cordialities here and there. A little bit wider, Hecht's connections were with W.H. Auden, with whom he stayed in the island of Ischia for a year in 1950-51. Ischia is right off of the coast of Naples, as you probably know. And Hecht was on his way to becoming the first fellow in the American Academy at Rome. Now it's one of his distinctions. He also was widely influenced by people like T.S. Eliot, Robert Lowell, to a lesser degree by Ted Hughes, and I already mentioned Auden in particular, but in ways that are really crucial with Hecht. Hecht we're talking about today, right? Hecht. Ways that are really crucial. He really is a kind of a peninsula. He just sort of sticks out there, grounded to the mainland of English literature, poetry, and without a lot of other, I mean, there are friends around him, but he's really a solitary poet in lots of ways. Of the many events in his poetry, probably the longest and most important, and the one that left the greatest impact, was his time in World War II. He was a Jewish kid from Manhattan, drafted, or signed up actually, in 1942-43, and then he was finally sent over to Europe in the early part of 1945, and he saw a lot of fighting, and probably most crucially, he participated in the liberation of the Flossenburg concentration camp, which was a very active workplace, though most of the people had left Flossenburg by the time Hecht arrived. He also served as a translator in French and German between prisoners and soldiers during his time. A lot of his great poems come out of that particular experience, and I'm going to read a couple of them today. Against the memories that were hideous for Hecht, the longest lasting was this war, as I told you about, but on the opposite side of it was his devotion to art, in particular, which poetry was one of its main branches, but not the only one that he chose to cultivate. And as we'll see today, it wasn't the only kind of art he appreciated. We're going to talk about other art as well, because he collaborated in various ways with artists in particular. And the thing I'm not going to be able to talk much about is his second marriage, which was terrific and long-lasting, and the great source of comfort for the second half of his life after a rather miserable first marriage. I'm going to just do a few, well, you've got a handout, so you've got a little treat that you're going to go home with today. I'm going to read through Hecht's poems, and with very little commentary, and I'm going to thread the needle rather than try to be comprehensive. But I thought for a moment I'd give you just a little bit of a slideshow to sort of wake everybody up. This is in celebration of Hecht. They've producing the collected poems, as you can see. This is a very nice picture of him about the age when I first knew him as well. He undergoes many different shapes, as you'll see. This has been edited wonderfully by Philip Hoy. I think it's going to become available in October. So I encourage you, if you are interested in Hecht, this is the text to buy. Rich notes, of which I did a great deal, but not all of them. Phil did most of them. Mrs. Hecht is the American Academy in Rome, having a bad day. You see the two fingers upside down victory. Normally they would be holding a cigarette, but they didn't just at this moment. He's becoming more established in the 60s. Anybody know who that fellow is on the Hecht's talking to? It's Auden. It's W.H. Auden. Just before the two of them gave a reading in the 92nd Street Y, they're just kind of, you can see the bottle there, cigarettes in each hand. Hecht looking like a dandy. He liked the dress. He liked clothes. He had great hair. Auden looking like, of course, a mess, as he so often was. But I've always admired those shins there. He's not even wearing slippers, which he normally does, but he's dressed for the occasion. Anyway, it's just a great shot between the two of them. That's Tony as I knew him, although I didn't know him there. This is on Fire Island. He's got wonderful hair, and this is one of the things that upset a lot of people, and he used to take a lot of hits from people, friends, about his hair. This is Hecht at a party, a T.S. Eliot celebration in St. Louis, and that's Meryl on his left, and obviously they're having fun. And they must have said some kind of dirty joke. She seems, I don't know who she is, but she seems like she's kind of really having a good time also. And I remember asking Jim Longenbach if he could identify the person to Meryl's left, and he just said, "Who is that creepy guy?" Jim didn't know. Anyway, this is Hecht looking more monumental, leaning against the library, the New York Public Library. This is a Raleigh McKenna photo, and you all know Raleigh McKenna. And she had a particular knack at capturing the image of a writer at their most characteristic. And Hecht, at this point, had won just about every prize imaginable. The Pulitzer, the Bollingen, he'd been, poetry consultant at the Library of Congress. He was on his way to winning the Wallace Stevens Award. They just kind of go on and on and on. And so here he's holding up, and I like to think of him as holding up the library. This is, I don't know if you're interested in this sort of thing, but the elbow is an important way in which you can kind of thrust yourself into the presence of people. And there we are, that's Helen in the middle, Tony on the left, and that's my wife on the right, Susan. And we're in the Norton Simon kind of garden. And this is Tony, this is 2004, and Tony's 81 years old. And this is in May. He had just been awarded the LA Prize, book prize, for his later collected poems and so forth, given for his career. And we were kind of kicking around for a few days together. And he was to die about 4 or 5 months later, but at this point, he had no idea that he was ailing, and so this is a very happy occasion for all of us there. Tony looks like he's looking at me taking the picture, but he was looking at a bird right above my head. He spent most of the time looking at birds in the garden and not paying much attention to what we were talking about. Anyway, that's the last picture I have of him. I'm going to show you other pictures in a few minutes, but I wanted to turn to some poems, okay? I want to try to keep track of the time. I know that Sally Wood has a train to get at 8:30, so we'll keep it short. You have your handout, right? And this is your little take-home packet, your little prize. There are about 7 or 8 poems. If we don't get to all of them, you'll have something to do on your own. This is one that I've never really written about. It doesn't get much publicity. It's called Curriculum Vitae, and it's about Rochester, where Hecht spent a lot of his time and where I spent a lot of my time too. And it describes something that I suspect everybody here, at least in the Northeast, has experienced. And I thought it was just a great way to start. It's a very simple poem, an elegant stanzaic construction of a very easy kind, alternating rhymes. The only complex thing is that the rhymes alternate in terms of their length, and but other than that, it's a very simple poem. Beautifully crafted. The phrase elegant always comes to mind, and usually that's a damning phrase to say about someone. But in Hecht's case, it's perfectly deserved. As though it were reluctant to be day, Morning deploys a scale of rarities in gray, and winter settles down in its chainmail, victorious over legions of gold and red. The smoky souls of stones, blunt pencilings of lead, pare down the world to glintless monotones of graveyard weather, vapors of a fen we reckon through our pores. Save for the garbage men, our children are the first one out of doors, book-bagged and padded out, at mouth and nose, they manufacture ghosts, George Washingtons and Poes, Banquos, the Union and Confederate hosts, and are themselves the ghosts, file cabinet gray, of some departed us, signing our lives away on ferned and parsleyed windows of a bus. I remember getting on the bus before, and the garbage men were I lived from Rochester, very cold. How many people grew up in cold environments and got on buses? It was something of our generation, you know, and he captures that beautifully. As I said, ghosts are going to be a common thread here, and in this case, the ghosts are of parent and child, and maybe ghosts also in the surrounding winter. And in that strange ferned and parsley windows of a bus, there are all kinds of images of something departing, whether it's Charon's boat or cattle cars, which will figure later. Next poem, More Light, More Light. This was done in 1960 and caused quite a brouhaha when it came out. This is the first really successful Hecht poem involving the concentration camps. This one he transposed to Buchenwald because Buchenwald was right by Weimar, which is where Goethe lived and died, and the phrase more light, comes, were supposedly Goethe's very last words. And Hecht was interested in those phrases, as you'll see, and of course the irony and disposition that develops. It's pretty straightforward. Composed, I should say two things. He does mention some people in England in the 16th century, Protestant martyrs, probably Hugh Latimer and Nicholas Ridley, as kind of prototypes and precursors of the violence that Hecht is going to get to. Composed in the Tower before his execution, these moving verses, and being brought at that time painfully to the stake, submitted, declaring thus, I implore my God to witness that I have made no crime. Nor was he forsaken of courage, but the death was horrible, the sack of gunpowder failing to ignite. His legs were blistered sticks on which the black sap bubbled and burst as he howled for the kindly light. And that was but one, by no means one of the worst, permitted at least his pitiful dignity, and such as were by made prayers in the name of Christ that shall judge all men for his soul's tranquility. We move now to outside a German wood. 3 men are there commanded to dig a hole in which the 2 Jews are ordered to lie down and be buried alive by the 3rd, who is a Pole. Not light from the shrine at Weimar beyond the hill, nor light from heaven appeared. But he did refuse. The Luger settled back deeply in its glove. He was ordered to change place with the Jews. Much casual death had drained away their souls. The thick dirt mounted toward the quivering chin. When only the head was exposed, the order came to dig him out again and to get back in. No light in the blue Polish eye. When he finished, a riding boot packed down the earth. The Luger hovered lightly in its glove. He was shot in the belly and in 3 hours bled to death. No prayers or incense rose up in those hours, which grew to be years, and every day came mute ghosts from the ovens, sifting through crisp air and settled upon his eyes and were black soot. In 1960, poems were written this way, prose occasionally, and it's worth remembering that Elie Wiesel's The Night, which of course is one of the real touchstones of personal experience, was also published in 1960 as well. Hecht didn't, I don't believe, had read it. This story comes called The Theory and Practice of Hell in 1950. One of the interesting things about writing about Hecht is I ran into various people as research takes you, and it turned out that the department administrator at UCLA's cousin, and I knew the department administrator quite well, cousin was named Jack Terry. And Jack Terry actually was was liberated from the Flossenburg concentration camp and went on to have a tremendous career as a psychologist and became quite famous in his own right because of all of his past and his present activities. And at one point he was invited to read at West Point and speak, and he read this poem and was, as from his point of view, the poem that really told the truth about what it was like to be in a concentration camp. Okay, we're going to have more light, but a different kind of light now. Okay, can everybody guess where this is? We're actually we're looking out from toward the Giudecca from, what's the name of the, San Giorgio, sì, grazie, sì. San Giorgio Maggiore. We're up in the tower there. And I just showed you that because I really wanted to set off this picture in particular. We're now looking toward what's St. Mark's. And to the left of St. Mark's is a very nice hotel, the Hotel Europa. And over on the left there is the Church Santa Maria della Salute. And all of this is going to figure into the little bit of verse of Hecht's that we're going to read. I'm giving you just a little excerpt from the Venetian Vespers, Hecht's longest poem, and in some people's view, his greatest poem. And you'll see this scene as we go through it here. Lights, I have chosen Venice for its light, its lightness, buoyancy, its calm suspension in time and water, its strange quietness. I, an expatriate American, living off an annuity, confront the lagoon's waters in mid-morning sun. Palladio's church floats at its anchored pace across from me, and the great Church of Health, voted in gratitude by the Venetians for heavenly deliverance from the plague, the looted, levels itself on the canal. Farther away, the lips of the crimped water sped by a light breeze. Morning has tooled the bay with bright inlays of writhing silver, scattered scintillance. These little crests and ripples promenade, hurried and jocular and ever bored. Ils se promenent like families of some means on Sundays in the Bois. Observing this easy festivity, hypnotized by tiny sun signals exchanged across the harbor, I am, for the moment, cured of everything. The future held at bay, the past submerged, even the fact that this sea of Adria, this consecrated cool wife of the Doge, was plowed by the merchantmen of all the world, and all the silicate fragility they sweat for at the furnaces now seems an admirable and shatterable triumph. They take the first crude bulb of thickened glass, glowing and taffy soft on the blow tube, and sink it in a mold, a metal cup, spiked on its inner surface like a pineapple. Half the glass now is regularly dimpled, and when these dimples are covered with a glaze of molten glass, they are prisoned air bubbles, breathless, enameled, describing Murano at the end there, where glass is blown and made into wonderful shapes. I wanted you just to read a little bit of this. Part of it is, this is just beautiful blank verse. Particularly in Hecht's middle career, he really fashioned it to extraordinary degrees. And just for sheer descriptive power, one of the things Hecht can do, Wallace Stevens also, particularly Milton all too, is they can just get a phrase up in the air and it just keeps going and it goes and it goes. And this is just an instance of how capable he is there. The speaker is actually in Venice to rid himself of wartime memories of which he's not successful. But his views of Venice, like this one, temporarily sort of give a little adhesive to his experience. Now, if you're in San Giorgio Maggiore and you go downstairs in it, you're going to see this painting by Tintoretto. It's the stoning, or in this case, the martyrdom of St. Stephen. I don't know how many of you are familiar with St. Stephen. He is the first martyr of the Christian church, described in Acts. And he's martyred by stones that were thrown at him. It's a very elaborate, long discussion in Acts about who Stephen is. Many people have written about St. Stephen, as you can imagine. And here he is, he's got the golden nimbus around his head. And there is God up there, and Jesus. And then there's a fellow named Paul. You can't see him, but this is Paul right there holding some clothes, and that's one of the identifiers of him. And the scene has all kinds of biblical significance that I'm not going to go into very much today. Let me just see if I... Oh, and this is just another picture of St. Stephen. This is by Giotto. A gorgeous piece. You see the little thing on the left and on the right that look like horns. That's Giotto's version of giving the stones that martyred him. Giotto didn't really want to mess up Stephen very much at all. Stephen was also famous for having a face like an angel. Very beautiful, and this shows him in that capacity. This one is by Michelangelo. And this is an absolutely incredible drawing, and he's being stoned. This is Stephen being stoned. And there's no heaven at all. There's no place. He's just getting beaten on, as you can see, and the gruesomeness of it. Now, you have a sonnet sequence, and I'm just going to kind of read through it here, called The Feast of Stephen. You might not know about Stephen at all, except that there's going to be an allusion very much at the end of the poem toward him. Hecht is really interested in arriving at another kind of explanation for Stephen and the stoning. And as you'll see from the four sonnets, there's a kind of pictorial history of masculine horseplay that gets worse and worse with each frame. Hecht is quite critical of bullying, and he himself was worried that his own son Evan was being bullied about the time when he wrote this, which was in the mid-1980s. Anyway, you get these separate little sonnets. The coltish horseplay of the locker room, moist with the steam of the tiled showered stalls, with shameless blends of civet, musk, and sweat, loud with the cap gun snapping of wet towels, under the steel-ribbed cages of bare bulbs in some such setting of thick basement pipes and janitorial realities, boys for the first time frankly eye each other, inspect each other's bodies at close range, and what they see is not so much another as a strange possible version of themselves, and all the sparring dance, adrenal life, tense, jubilant nimbleness is but a vague, busy, unfocused ballet of self-love. If the heart has its reasons, perhaps the body has its own lumbering sort of carnal spirit, felt in the tingling bruises of collision, and known to captains as esprit de corps. What is this brisk fraternity of timing, pivot and lobbing arc, or indirections, men's sauna in men's sauna, in the flush of health and toilets, private and corporal glee, these fleet caroms, plies and genuflections before the salmon leap, the leaping fountains, all sheathed in glistening light, flexed and alert. From the vast echo chamber of the gym, among the scumbled shouts and shrill of whistles, the bounced basketball sound of a leather whip. Think of those barren places where men gather to act in the terrible name of rectitude, of acting shame, punk's pride, muscle or turf, the bully's thin superiority. Think of this is where Willard should read these lines. Think of the Sturm, Willard.
Sturmabteilungskommandant.
Thank you. I don't know German, obviously. Who loves Beethoven and collects Degas. Or the blonde boys in jeans whose narrowed eyes are focused by some hard and smothered lust, who lounge in a studied mimicry of ease, flick their live butts into the standing weeds, and comb their hair in the mirror of cracked windows of an abandoned warehouse where they keep in darkened readiness for their occasion the rope, the chains, handcuffs, and gasoline. Out in the rippled heat of a neighbor's field, in the kilowatts of noon, they've got one cornered. The bugs are jumping, and the burly youths, stripped to the waist for the hot work ahead. They go to arm themselves at the dry stone wall, having flung down their wet and salty garments at the feet of a young man whose name is Saul. He watches sharply these superbly tanned figures with a swimmer's chest and shoulders, a miler's thighs with their self-conscious grace, and in between their sleek, converging bodies, brilliantly oiled and burnished by the sun, he catches a brief glimpse of bloodied hair and hears an unintelligible prayer. The unintelligible prayer was actually the prayer that Stephen prayed for in his last moments, that God would do no harm to the people who had just killed him. Hecht was a very powerful antithetical reader of Paul, and that comes out here quite subtly. And I can go into that at some later point, but that was one of the motivating impulses in this poem. But the main motivating one was just a kind of study of brutality and how it moves in the masculine culture, which he was pretty familiar with, from sports arenas to killing people. Now for some fun. The wonderful thing about Bishop is, on a gravestone it says awful but cheerful. All the untidy activity continues. If one were to write Hecht's gravestone, it would be awful and a little more awful. It just, poems get you down and go further and further down. So this is a little bit of light humor by his standard. This is, I mentioned, no, I guess I didn't mention, that Hecht collaborated with Leonard Baskin. Leonard Baskin was an incredible engraver, very important engraver, book engraver, from the 1960s, especially earlier than that, really 1950s. He did all kinds of engravings, and his works were known by everybody in my generation, less so by the younger generation, which is fairly typical. And many of them still can be found in Northampton as well. He was at Smith for many years, and it was at Smith that Hecht encountered him. And I actually have a little, and they collaborated on a number of projects. And there's Tony did Baskin's eulogy. Baskin died in 2000, and one of near the end of the eulogy, he just speaks, and I thought I would just quote Hecht on Baskin. This is Hecht speaking about Baskin. One of our later undertaking undertakings was a book called The Presumptions of Death. It was Leonard who proposed the topic and the title. His long acquaintance with the theme dated, at the very least, from the time I first knew him, when his first wife, Esther, was stricken with incurable illness. At the time, he was making small, exquisitely cast bronze figures of hanged men. And when, very much later, he proposed death for our theme, I was perfectly ready to comply. It is, after all, impossible to be a member of our generation that witnessed the Holocaust, the use of nuclear bombs against civilian populations, the devastation of AIDS, and not feel the weight and smell, the stench of mortality. So they were bound on this project. I'm not going to read this poem. It's quite wonderful. Death the Painter, and this is Baskin, obviously doing a version of a self-portrait of himself there. I do want to do the next one, and I do have a copy of that for you. It's called Death the Poet. You can see on the right the laurel crown on the skull, the prize of poetry. On the left is a kind of very famous portrait of Dante, and the two are looking at each other, obviously. Hecht's poem is called A Ballad Lament for the Makers. And this is a particular kind of stanzaic structure, and I'll just say a few words about it, since Hecht observes stanzas all the time. He's very keen with form. It is really constructed out of 3 rhymes only, and those 3 rhymes repeat in the 3 stanzas, and then the final stanza is just constructed out of 2 rhymes, so it even slims down as the stanza slims down. So he's really working within a tremendously constricted form. What's rather wonderful about it is that not only is it constricted, but Hecht throws in a little Latin as part of his rhyme, just to sort of show you he can do it. The Latin line comes from, in this case, John Skelton, 15th century poet and poet laureate, E nunc in polvere dormio, which means, and now I sleep in the dust. We use the word pulverize all the time without quite being aware of its Latin root. Anyway, here it is. Where have they gone, the lordly makers, torchlight and fire folk of our skies, those grand authorial earth shakers who brought such gladness to the eyes of the knowing and unworldly wise in damnest language long ago? Call them, and nobody replies. E nunc in polvere dormio. The softly spoken verbal Quakers who made no fuss and told no lies, baroque and intricate risk takers, full of elliptical surprise from Mother Goose to Paradise Lost and Regained, where did they go? This living hand indicts and dies, e nunc in polvere dormio. Old masters, thunderous as the breakers, Tennyson's eloquence defies. Beneath uncultivated acres, our great original Shakespeare lies, with Grub Street hacks you despise, quelled by the common ratio that cuts all scribblers down to size, e nunc in polvere dormio. Archduke of Darkness, who supplies the deadline governing joy and woe, here I put off my flesh disguise, e nunc in polvere dormio. If for no other reason, but there are other reasons, the poem survives partly because of that great phrase, Archduke of Darkness. You hear it once, you always remember it, and of course it has its perfect application in the poet Hecht, who is, if nothing else, the Archduke of Darkness, regal in his poetics. I think we're doing okay on time. We're going to get to Sally's train. Okay. Oh, no. Oh, God. Uh-oh, I'm in trouble. There we go. Let's see. I want to get this in. No. Just a minute. This may be a moment for Millie. What am I doing that won't allow it to I did that. Oh, but I did it too hard. This is a painting by Matisse, as you can gather from the head note here. And this was actually, Jory Graham was going to put together a collection of essays on art in the University of Iowa Art Gallery, which is where this one is. It never came about. A great idea that is in papers, among her papers, which I guess were probably at Harvard. But Tony wrote this, I think, just fabulous poem about this Matisse painting, and also it just gives you something kind of fun to look at after all the other darkness. This is real color we've got. It has quite a long note by Robert Hughes, and I still will read it. It's part of the poem. He lived through he meaning Matisse, lived through some of the most traumatic political events of recorded history, the worst wars, the greatest slaughters, the most demented rivalries of ideology without, it seems, turning a hair. Perhaps Matisse did suffer from fear and loathing like the rest of us, but there's no trace of them in his work. His studio was a world within a world, a place of equilibrium, that for 60 continuous years produced images of comfort, refuge, and balanced satisfaction. So here's Tony's, and Tony's is really just a kind of imaginative view of the painting divided between outside and inside, and quite loose verse for him. Outside is variable May, a lawn of immediate green, the tree as blue as its shadow. The shutter angles out in charitable shade. It is a world of yearning. We yearn for it. Its youthful natives yearn for one another. Their flesh is firm as a plum, their smooth tanned waists lit through the fluttered leaves above their heads are rubbed and cinctured with this morning's bangles. Yet each, if we but take thought, is a lean gnomon, a bone finger with its moral point, the hour, the minute, the dissolving pleasure. Light fails, the shadows pool themselves in hollows. Here in the stifling fragrance of mock orange, in the casual glance, the bright lust of the eye, lies the hot spring of inevitable tears. Within is the cool, blue, perfect cube of thought. The branched spirea, carefully arranged, is no longer random growth. It now becomes the object of our thought. It becomes our thought. The room is a retreat in which the drone of the electric fan is modest, unassertive, faithful as with a promise of lemonade and other gentle solaces of summer, among which, for the two serene young girls in this cool tank of blue, is an open book, where they behold the pure, unchanging text of manifold, reverberating depth, quiet and tearless in its permanence. Deep in their contemplation, the two girls regarding art have become art themselves. Once out of nature, they have settled here in this blue room of thought, beyond the reach of the small, brief, sad ambitions of the flesh. Anyway, that painting prompted this poem. How are we doing for time? Oh, okay, great. We're on schedule, pretty much. I wanted to read something before we get to the last poem. And this is on the jacket of Hecht's poem. And it's written by Brad Lighthouser. Okay, it's really one of the very best short statements about Hecht's art. Hecht's approach in poem after poem has been measured and thoughtful, avoiding the reciprocal temptations of self-pity and the more dangerous, because the less frequently condemned, of self-congratulation at his own toughness. But if he comes at his subject directly, he does not do so lightly armed. Most of his work is formal in two senses, elevated and patterned. He is probably the grandest of our contemporary poets in tone and dignity. With his ramified syntax, his venturesome Latinate vocabulary, and his readiness to retrieve words and constructions that verge on archaisms, he presents a voice of unexampled refinement. It's not the sort of voice one would expect to hear dealing with torture or mayhem. Much of the power of his work derives, in fact, from the incongruous tension that results when the most civilized of voices confronts civilization's most gruesome barbarities. And we've seen that in some of the poems already, particularly More Light, More Light, and we're going to see it again in one more instance of it. You have the Book of Yolek as your last poem. This is a sestina. As I said, Hecht liked complex forms. This sestina and Elizabeth Bishop's poem called Sestina are, I think, the two great sestinas of the second half of the century. Hers gets much more play because she gets much more play, but everybody who reads this poem also sits down and wonders about it. I can talk about it in a bit further. He took it from a source in 1973, an anthology of Holocaust literature. But what I'm really going to do, oops, something fell off. But what I want to do is I actually want to escape right now and give you a treat. I think. Okay, yes, it's good. This is going to work. I've done this part successfully. Hecht had an English accent. Why did he have an English accent? Because he didn't want to sound like a Jewish kid from Manhattan as a poet in the 1950s and 60s when he was refiguring his identity or figuring his identity. And at that point, remember, one of the greatest of all the poets in the 20th century was T.S. Eliot. And Eliot must have done some incredibly strange things to his voice to go for the Mississippi River of all places. You know. Anyway, so you're going to get Hecht, and Hecht is reading this Book of Yolek. It's written in July of 2004. He's going to die shortly thereafter, but again, rather innocent at this point. But he's a little bit weaker. At any rate, I hope this is going to work.
Called the Book of Yolek.
Don't worry, we'll get there.
Wir haben ein Gesetz und nach dem Gesetz soll sterben, which is Martin Luther's translation of what we know as the Gospel of John, chapter 19, verse 9. We have a law, and by that law he must die. The poem is called the Book of Yolek. The doused coals fume and hiss after your meal of grilled brook trout, and you saunter off for a walk down the fern trail. It doesn't matter where to, just so you're weeks and worlds away from home, and among midsummer hills have set up camp in the deep bronze glories of declining day. You remember peacefully an earlier day in childhood, remember a quite specific meal, a corn roast and bonfire in summer camp. That summer you got lost on a nature walk. More than you dared admit, you thought of home. No one else knows where the mind wanders to. The 5th of August, 1942. It was morning and very hot. It was the day they came at dawn with rifles to the home for Jewish children, cutting short the meal of bread and soup, lining them up to walk in close formation off to a special camp. How often you have thought about that camp, as though in some strange way you were driven to, and about the children, and how they were made to walk. Yolek, who had bad lungs, who wasn't a day over 5 years old, commanded to leave his meal and shamble between armed guards to his long home. We're approaching August again. It will drive home the regulation torments of that camp Yolek was sent to, his small, unfinished meal, the electric fences, the numeral tattoo, the quite extraordinary heat of the day they all were forced to take that terrible walk. Whether on a silent, solitary walk or among crowds, far off or safe at home, you will remember helplessly that day and the smell of smoke and the loudspeakers of the camp. Wherever you are, Yolek will be there too. His unuttered name will interrupt your meal. Prepare to receive him in your home someday. Though they killed him in the camp they sent him to, he will walk in as you're sitting down to a meal.
It's about 5:50, so maybe that's a good note to end on, or a terrible note to end on. But it's a powerful note, one way or the other. I want to thank you for being such great guests. I'm happy to take questions if you want, but I think you've been terrific. And it's Sunday, and I hear the cocktail hour coming down the track. Anyway, so thank you very much. We have, if anybody has questions, I'm happy to take them and do my best. Yeah, hi Pam.
What is written on Anthony? I've seen hard copy.
Yeah, it's a line from a wonderful poem called Peripeteia. His wife actually had it put on there. Peripeteia is a poem about Miranda walking out of the theater and grabbing him, or off the stage, and grabbing the viewer by the hand, and that person is his wife. And the lines from the grave are exactly those lines. I don't have my book with me, but I could get them. About 4 or 5 lines from them. It would have been nice if it had Archduke of Darkness, but I think that probably would have been going too much. Anyway, the one thing I might just show you about, Yolek is a hard poem to come back from, and I remember sending it to Jack Terry, again, the Flossenburg inmate, liberated, and he wrote back and he said he had no words but tears. And it's a tearjerker. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the story of Janusz Korczak, who was the great Polish educator, and he was in charge of this Jewish camp for children, orphans. And Korczak was much admired by the Germans because of his literacy and the use of his academic books and so forth. And on a number of occasions, they tried to school before the Nazis came and took them all to probably Treblinka. But he chose the hero's death and refused and stayed with the boys to the camp. Anyway, there's a statue of him in Warsaw, and there are movies made of him and books upon books. The extraordinary thing about Hecht's poem is that he didn't write, Korczak is much celebrated and need a poem. Hecht finds this little kid, this innocent, and throughout Hecht there is this motif of the protection of the innocent in particular, and so it is with Yolek. One of only there are about 20 people named in this short saga that describes Yolek, or describes the Korczak and the camp. Anyway, it's remarkable. The one thing I will show this one thing if I can figure out how to get back into my slides. This might be another Millie moment. Let's see. That's not where I want to be. Okay, perfect. Yeah, that's it. This is just total academic stuff. Okay, so no one else has to pay any attention except for maybe 2 people in here, 3 people. But We have very few drafts of Hecht's poems, but this is one of them. It's of the Book of Yolok. And I remember talking to Tony about sestinas, because he wrote an article, something for me on sestinas. And he said the remarkable thing about Elizabeth Bishop's sestina, called sestina, is it tells a story. And what's remarkable about that is sestinas constantly keep backing up on themselves. They don't really want to tell stories because of the way in which the terminal words keep repeating over and over again. They give you different little angles and stuff like that. But Bishop tells a story of a little girl and gives you a full view of what it's like to be in this Nova Scotia house. But what Tony really had in mind, although he didn't say it, of course, but all poets do when they talk about someone else's work, is he had his own poem in mind, because this is a poem driven by a story. And what's extraordinary is this is the very first page, first draft. It was called The Law initially. But it was the 5th of August 1942. And he starts giving the historical narration if he's going to tell it as a kind of historical story. He gets away from that after thinking about it, and he begins by telling you about he was a camper as a little kid, about his camp experiences. Not so identified, absolutely. But then he transposes and modifies that stanza that appears number 1 there and puts it in the 3rd position, and also gets rid of the "it was" formula. And he simply just gives you the date. And I know that when you first read that poem, when you first hear the poem, you think you're having a wonderful time at camp. And those little words, camp, to, home, meal, they come around in a rather nice way. And then you get that sudden change. The 5th of August, 1942, which is a perfect pentameter line. And the world has changed, and the poem has changed. And it's radical and gut-wrenching. And it's interesting just to see how a great poem, had such a kind of pedestrian beginning in some ways, and which should be encouraging to everybody who wants to write great sestinas in particular. He also jots down the form. You can see that he's working on the line structure. Sestinas, they have a very strict formula, 6-1-5-2-4-3, and it keeps rotating as you go through the 6 stanzas to the final tercet. And you can see Tony's 6-1-5-2-4-3 right here, and just getting day, meal, camp, walk, house, or home, too. And it's just fabulous to sort of see the mind. He's got the pieces there, but doesn't have the poem, and then, we move ahead in time to that poem. At any rate, yeah, Ken.
But since you're talking about Hecht and sestinas, you might mention that he wrote a really terrific essay on the poet Sidney,
Yes.
double sestina,
Right.
in which he does something rather daring. He takes a view very different from the most famous essay on that.
Empson. No, he does.
Great essay.
Thank you. Yeah, Tony wrote that essay for me.
For
For me.
you.
Yeah, for a collection of essays I was putting together. Yeah, so thank you. Yeah.
Wouldn't exist without you.
I hadn't planned this.
Yeah. Well, I was selecting poets to write on topics, and the sestina seemed an obvious one, and, he was the guy, right? Peter. Hi, Peter.
So much of what he wrote seems to have been influenced by his experience before his death. I wonder what he wrote before the war. Incidents, preoccupations, or how his poetry.
He didn't write much before the war because it was 1942. He was born in 1923. He had some poems in Bard, in the Bardian newspaper, and he even did some limericks. He was a very good light writer. I'm giving you the dark side. He had a very funny side to him, and when he was younger, that more limerick side would appear more frequently. The trick for him was when he went to war, he then tried to write. He was at Kenyon College after the war. He then tried to write war poems after the war, and they weren't any good. And he wrote about other topics, and they were okay, and they were quite spirited and fun and quite light in various ways. And then he finally got to be able to write about the topic, which was really at the center of his consciousness, the grimness of that aspect. And then, I should be chastised for presenting just the dark. I mean, there is a lighter version of Hecht, but that light version gets darker and darker over the years, too. But you see, a poem like Iolach is interesting. I mean, it's not a laugh poem by a long shot. But, I mean, it's just such an incredible work of art. The Sestina is just doing so much. Seamus Heaney would say this is a poem that deserves to live against all of the bad things that have happened, and has its own. And I think that's really where Tony increasingly, went for that position. And he had to be very careful about it because, although he was Jewish, and part of the liberation of the camps, I mean, he was pretty darn close to pretty raw at that point. But he was not ever an inmate in one of the camps. And so he was very careful about not wanting to overstep that particular area. Sylvia Plath was quite willing to overstep it at any opportunity, and one of the reasons why Sylvia Plath ridiculed Tony Hecht's hair is because the two of them went back and forth on this particular issue involving the Holocaust. They were at Smith together. It was not an easy relationship or friendship to have. But that's a good question. Thank you for that. Any other? Well, I'm sure there are other questions. Yeah, hi. I didn't hear the last part. What do I think of today's more radical poets? I'm not really qualified to answer that one. Hecht was radical in the sense, not at all in terms of form, obviously. I mean, or even the way in which he disposed his subject matter. He was radical in the sense of really wanting to get at the morality, the ethics of the experience that he lived. And it's hard for me to speak about radicalism. I just don't know it well enough to be able to kind of make a grand statement. Do you have some thoughts on that? Yeah. No. Anyway, I mean, there are some wonderful radical things being written, but I don't have a view of the whole genre. Yeah.
So it seems strange to me that a Jewish boy from Brooklyn has some references. So did something happen?
It's a great question. Hecht is a Jewish kid from Manhattan, went to private schools to a great degree, and the English curriculum like Milton and Shakespeare. He was really a Renaissance thinker in lots of ways. But as he aged, and by the way, and T.S. Eliot was very important in his thinking, and Eliot, of course, as you know, was pretty high church. But as Hecht aged, he became more and more aware of his earlier history and his identity as a Jew, and more sensitive to anti-Jewish sentiment and so forth, which he understood and endured and so on. And so that strain in his thinking became stronger and stronger. And he particularly didn't like Paul for a couple of reasons. One is he didn't believe the story of Paul's enlightenment. He thought it might have been just some kind of, physical attack or epileptic response. His brother was an epileptic, and he had some thoughts about Jews, and particularly for people who believed deeply in what we would call the Hebrew Bible, but when Paul named it, it became known as the Old Testament. And in that sense, Paul was one of the great negative forces in Christianity against Jews. And yet he himself, of course, had been a Jew. So I think Tony was really pretty annoyed, and he wrote a wonderful essay on Galatians about that experience. And in this particular, the stoning of St. Stephen, Paul is not called Paul, he's called Saul in that poem. So it's the pre-conversion moment. Tony's not going to let him be converted in the Illuminati they became. So that's kind of at the base of that story. And Tony's distrust of Paul. Yeah, Willard.
I would say that in this regard, the person to compare him to is almost exact contemporary Howard Nemerov, who also grew up in an entirely secular Jewish family in New York. Neither of these men had anything like religious belief or anything but barest religious observances. And both of them became aware of what was happening in the camps during the war and after the war.
Yeah. And I think for Tony, it wasn't just the camps, it was the gradual increasing recognition as a Jewish person in an English department that was pretty waspy, that there were real issues that were going on there too. So, I mean, you have this odd split where the poets he most admired, or among the poets he most admired, they were part of a culture which he was sort of separating himself from. And the book, I mean, the Book of Ulick is just, I mean, you know, that's a poem that makes use of an old Italian form, and that had come through England and so forth, and now is given a very specific turn toward the Jewish subject. Well, and yeah, Robert.
Jonathan, thanks so much. The later poems, which I kind of plowed through this afternoon, I'm going to do some homework.
Right.
I love the death personified ones.
Yeah.
Death doll scribblers. You know, I actually found them really funny.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if, you know, I know that he woke up screaming from his experiences at the camp and so forth. I thought taking on the point of view of death in those different poems, was that like sort of freeing for him, or did he ever talk about that to you?
First of all, Tony never talked to me much about his poetry. Okay, period. I mean, there was
Birds.
Yeah, bird. He wasn't even talking to me about the bird. He just saw the bird above my head. I think the answer is that he had a very dark and funny sense of humor, and those poems are, in many cases, funny. It's not Death the Poet so much, but some of them really are kind of wild. And clearly, putting on that persona allowed for a lot of grisly humor. You know? So it wasn't that, you know, it may be that, to go back to the Baskin thing, HIV, nuclear bomb, all of those things help to characterize the second half of the 20th century. But there is also the notion of living, and we have to do things. And those poems are among the fun ones to read. When I taught Hecht regularly to undergraduates, I always used a couple of those because they were they like to see the visuals, and also it got them into a certain kind of humor. One of the things I should mention, and really I didn't rattle on too long, Hecht with John Hollander invented this form called the double dactyl, and it became quite infamous, and it's even had a resurgence of late. And essentially, it's a splendidly comic form about a certain linguistic line. And at any rate, you have all really withstood this onslaught for long enough. I can just hear the sound of champagne going into the glass. Thank you very much. Thank you.
I just want to say one thing. Never exaggerate.